Welcome to this week's edition of Insights. On today's show, we're going to be talking about three different topics. The ongoing fight against COVID in Armenia. The second one we're going to be discussing are the results of the local elections, which happened earlier this week. And the last one is going to be regarding the very interesting and intriguing comments that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has made regarding Armenia and Artsakh, and we will go over them. The first one, and this is the most worrying one, which is the fight against COVID-19. To say it bluntly, we are failing in that fight. We have vaccination rates that hover somewhere around 10% or less. These numbers are somewhat unclear because so many of the vaccinations that have happened in Armenia have actually happened to tourists or foreigners that have come here, usually from Iran, India, Russia, and other places. We're failing this fight, despite the fact that we're one of the few countries that actually has vaccines that are readily available. So we have a situation in which we have vaccines here that are readily available and people are not using them, while people from other countries travel here long distances, sometimes driving as long as 2 days to get here to receive them. What this has led to is essentially the fourth wave of COVID that we're dealing with. Our daily numbers are somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 a day, actually closer to 2,000 the last couple of days. We're averaging about 30 or 40 deaths a day, completely unnecessary. And what is the driving force behind this is multiple things. One of it is this intense misinformation campaign, mostly on social media, or disinformation campaign. Most of this really comes out of three places in the world: the United States, China, and Russia. It's disseminated here locally. It's widely believed. In polling, up to 70% of people in this country would refuse vaccination, which is absurd given what we know about the science of vaccines. What does this point to? I think this is there are some cultural issues here. After all, we're a country that has 3 million prime ministers. During the war, we had 3 million defense ministers, and now we have 3 million public health officials or experts. So there's an element in our culture, which is this anarchist collective, that everybody is their own boss and can make their own decisions, which is good in certain senses, but disastrous in this case. But I do not put the blame on ordinary people. Ultimately, this is about political leadership. The prime minister should be on television explaining to people what is what the vaccine does, why it's important to be vaccinated, and to use some of his political capital in making that happen. This is about leadership. It is about saying the unpopular things and essentially explaining the counter arguments to the falsehoods that are being put out there. Second of all, we can put the blame on our president, who actually happens to be a scientist. He should be the teacher of the country. He should be the leader of the country in explaining to people how science works. And lastly, our health ministry, as much as I actually approve of our current health minister, is actually failing in its job in educating the public about the need for vaccinations. The second topic of the week that we're going to be covering involves local elections and the results from them. We had local elections across the country that, for the most part, were a rebuke to the current ruling party, which is the civil contract party of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. In Gyumri, the incumbent mayor running as independent defeated Mr. Pashinyan's party's candidate. And the same thing was true in the town of Goris in Syunik. In Mehri, which is the city that essentially mirrors the Iranian border, the candidate led from Sarkisyan's party won that election. The ruling party did win elections in some smaller towns and villages like Dilijan, Ter, and Tatev, but for the most part, this was a rebuke to the ruling party. How do we analyze this? I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. First and foremost, it's very clear that the ruling party is not as popular as the prime minister himself. What this means is that if he's not leading the ticket, he cannot deliver based on his party, because politics in Armenia is so personalized that it's really not about his party, it's about himself, which means essentially beyond himself, he can't necessarily deliver for other people to the extent that he could for himself. The second thing I think is it's becoming clear that now that the fear that people had of the return of the old regime is receding because of the election results from last June, there's far and far greater focus on the actions of this current government, its failures and its successes. And they're being judged not by what people fear would return, but by the results of their work. The last thing which I think will help explain this result is that all politics on some level is local. And local elections, I've been involved with them in the United States for years, essentially they can be far more vicious than even national politics. And they have local factors and people vote on them on different matters. However, I think in this case, they are telling us something thematically about the direction of the country and what people see, what they think of the ruling party. We are so used to negative news, and most news, unfortunately, is negative almost anywhere in the world, and certainly that's no different here. But I think we need to step back and look at one of the key phrases from this headline, which is that the ruling party loses. Why is that important? The ruling party loses here, and there were no calls for re-elections, there were no arrests. This is what it means to be an island of freedom in a sea of tyranny. We know to the country to the east of us, there are no elections, local or national, that matter or are competitive in any way. We are different. We get to choose our rulers, and when people lose, they leave, which makes us the exception. To the country to the west of us, if the ruler doesn't like the result, they redo the elections. And if you happen to be Kurdish and you win the elections, as in most of the towns in eastern Turkey, they will put you in jail. So we need to be proud of this accomplishment, of what we have accomplished here in this small island of freedom, surrounded by this sea of neo-fascist tyranny. We're going to finish the show with some intriguing comments that have been made by Russian President Vladimir Putin in regards to Armenia and Artsakh, which are interesting and frankly hard to decipher. And you would need to sort of think them through of what he's actually trying to say. There's two episodes of this. One, though, he held a press conference after his meeting with the Turkish dictator, Erdogan, while Erdogan was standing there, and he talked about the joint Russian-Turkish Peace Monitoring Center in Aghdam, in which he described Aghdam as his location, as the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, for people who know geography, Aghdam is actually immediately to the east of Artsakh, which, if you actually read through what he's saying, literally, he's saying that Artsakh is Armenia. The second one, which happened during a Zoom call of the CIS leaders, CIS being the Commonwealth of Independent States, which are essentially all the countries of the former Soviet Union except the Baltic states, where Ilhan Aliyev himself was on the Zoom call. He talked about Russian demining works that are being done in Azerbaijan and in Armenia. Well, the only demining works that are being done by Russian peacekeepers is actually in Artsakh and in territories controlled by the Azeri dictator, which again, if you read through it, he is clearly defining Artsakh as Armenian. Now, what does this mean? We really don't know what it means. There are people speculating that Mr. Putin can be having his senior moments, and there's others who say that a guy who is as deliberate as he is, where he doesn't utter unmeasured words. These are clear demarcation lines of what he thinks is what and who belongs to whom. And by doing so, sending a clear message both to the Azeri and the Turkish regimes of what he thinks of Artsakh and its status. Frankly, we will never know what he means. And I think what we should not do is either take comfort in what he says, if he thinks he's essentially declaring Artsakh Armenian, or not. You have to have the kind of politics, you have to have the kind of country, you have to have the kind of military where you're not dependent on the kindness of strangers. So we should note what he said, understand it for what it's worth, but we should not be distracted about the job that we need to do, which again, as we have said repeatedly, is to build a competent state, a competent military, and a competent economy. Thank you for joining me in this week's edition of Insights.